Your journey started in a time when opportunities, women, especially Black women in South Africa, were incredibly limited. What were the defining moments in your early life that shaped your vision for economic empowerment? But before we get into that first question, I want us to just dive back, right, to who is Wendy Luhabe? Where is she from? Let's dive back into where she started hiding from her parents when she was asked to do chores in the trees there. You know, when hens were laying eggs, you were asked to cook eggs for your parents. Let's start from the background. Who's Wendy Luhabe? Where is she from? And yes, let's just begin.
I grew up in the old Benoni location in the late 50s, and there were four of us. I had an older sister, I'm the second born, and I have a brother after me, and I have a younger sister. We experienced the brutality of the apartheid system when we were probably around the age of 8, when we were forcibly removed from the old Benoni location to Davidton. And in those years, people who lived in those communities had proper homes. So we were moved from a proper home with chicken running around, with trees, fruit trees. I remember we had a huge peach tree in our yard, and we used to harvest the peaches in December every year and can them in bottles so that they would last us for the rest of the year. And we were moved from what was really a decent living condition, even though it was disadvantaged, to a forum house in Davidton, which required a major adjustment for us, having lived in a much bigger home that had become a home for us. That's really, and I guess as a way of actually answering your question, is that's where we are shaped. It always begins at home, and how we grow up, and those earlier experiences. That's really where we are. That's where we are shaped, and that's when we are shaped. But to answer your question, let me start with my mother, who was a qualified nurse, and her highest salary during her working time or her working life never exceeded 1,000 rands as we were growing up. And so she became an entrepreneur, really as a way of making ends meet, because that clearly was not a sufficient salary with 4 children. And we grew up selling amasi at home. She was selling sour milk, and that's how she augmented and supplemented her meager income as a single mother. By then, she was a single mother. She had left her marriage in the mid-60s, something that was not done among her generation of women. I can't imagine the courage that it must have taken her to make that decision. But she made the decision nonetheless and decided to start again. So that was part of the early experience that shaped me, being forcibly removed from home, rearranging your stability as a child, and then going through a process of ending up with one parent, having started your early life with both parents. But I initially wanted to become a social worker, following in the footsteps of women before me, who at the time were encouraged to study social sciences. And this, of course, was the highest qualification in the 70s, and in the early 80s. Of course, it changed much later. And after 2 years of social sciences at the University of Fort Hare, 1976 intervened when there were major disruptions in the education system throughout South Africa. And that changed my plans. I then convinced my mother to continue my studies at the University of Lesotho. So that's why when you look at my profiles, you will see a mention of both universities. So initially I was at the University of Fort Hare, the intention of becoming a social worker, and due to the 1976 disruptions, I then changed universities to the University of Lesotho. But they did not offer social sciences, so I had to choose another field of study. And that is how I was thrust into the world of commerce. And I was lucky enough to join the first generation of Black women to qualify with a commerce degree in 1981. And this really, for me, was more by accident. It wasn't something I had planned, or maybe it was a God incidence. You know, some people say there are no accidents in life. There are God incidences. You know, there are things that God plans in our lives that we're not conscious of, and we get thrust into them. So these were some of my early life defining moments, which rearranged my life, especially after witnessing my mother make ends meet to give us an education. And I consider myself quite blessed that I was inspired by my own mother throughout my formative years. And as I was going through my education studies, and many other women of her generation, like Marina Maponya. These are probably women that you may not have heard of, who became a pioneer for Black women in business, and was amongst the first Black women to serve on boards. So she definitely inspired me in that sense, and I followed very much in her footsteps, and I was inspired by her life.
Thank you for the introduction. It just explains everything, the background of who really is Wendy Luhabe. Now I'm just gonna get into now the other question of the women investment portfolio holdings. It was a groundbreaking initiative offering women access to like financial independence, you know, in terms of entrepreneurship and business skills, and you know, just for them to propel their careers in entrepreneurship. What were the biggest challenges you have faced in convincing women's economic empowerment was not just a social issue, but an economic imperative?
Let me give you some background to the formation of WIPOLD. There were 4 of us who developed the idea in 1993. And it took us 18 months of meeting weekly for a few hours in my offices, because by this time I had ventured into starting my first business in human resources. And we used the time to consult broadly, including women at the time that were community leaders, women like Mrs. Mutlana, who was Dr. Mutlana's wife, Mrs. Sirobe, who was a mother-in-law to one of the founder members of WIPOLD, and Mrs. Siroke, amongst many other women. And the idea of consulting these Black women community leaders was that we were going to be convincing communities to invest money into an idea that was groundbreaking, as you have mentioned, and communities that didn't really know who we were. So we felt it was important to use these known community leaders as a bridge between ourselves as young women, the vision that we had, and the communities that we really wanted to benefit. And so it took a long time. It took 18 months because we felt it was important to clarify the vision and to test it. So that was the first thing that we needed to do. And we did that by consulting a whole range of people who understood about investments and what we were trying to do, and people that we would have to convince to put money into the idea. And secondly, we needed the time to develop workshops that we used to share the vision with hundreds of women throughout all 9 provinces. As far as I'm aware, it's probably the only empowerment initiative that reached every single province in the country, because we didn't want any women to be left behind. And so all of these audacious things that we wanted to do required time. And of course, when we started WePolled, we were inspired and emboldened by 2 major events that took place in the country. The first one was South Africa's democracy. And we were inspired by the early empowerment initiatives that were started in 1993 by NAIL, which was Dr. Mutlana and people like Advocate Dikgang Moseneke, those kinds of people that, excuse me, you may or may not have heard of. Real Africa was another one. And the third one was worldwide investments. As much as these early empowerment initiatives inspired us, they excluded women. All of them did not include women in their formation. And it was for that reason that we decided that perhaps we should take this upon ourselves and get involved in starting WePolled. I mean, it was quite a courageous decision to take, but we felt inspired nonetheless because these empowerment entities had already demonstrated that it was possible. They had shown the way. And we decided that rather than convince them to include us, we should actually start on our own and find out what's possible. Some of the biggest challenges were to convince women themselves that this was an idea worth investing in and worth pursuing. It was new, and it was happening at the heels of a number of Ponzi schemes that had scammed people. So the level of trust amongst women in particular was quite low. So that was one of the biggest challenges. And it was quite challenging to convince women that they needed to take a financial risk and invest in a vision that would enable all of us to become architects of our own economic empowerment. I mean, again, because this was such a new idea. And that's why we felt we needed such a long period of time to really address people's concerns, to educate people, to help show people that this was a risk that was worth taking. The next biggest challenge was to raise the seed capital, because to start any business, you need seed capital. And at the time of starting WePolled, we really didn't have much money amongst ourselves, but luckily we were able to raise an amount of 500,000 between the 4 of us to get started. And what really launched us was that we attracted a few business people who were benevolent enough to support us financially to invest in our vision, who were inspired in what we were doing. The third biggest challenge was that as much as we had been successful executives in our corporate positions, we had not run a company. So it was important to identify people who would support us, who had the necessary experience to guide us in the best way to build a business. So those were some of the challenges and some of the formative lessons of starting Wiphold.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Just very refreshing background of this now big corporation as it is, with its net value of very huge amount. Looking at the landscape today, do you think South Africa has made significant progress in women's economic inclusion? And is there still a long way to go, or is there still a long way to go?
We've certainly made some progress, Langelihle, but 30 years is a very short time in history of transforming a system that has a legacy that dates over many centuries. So I think it's work in progress. We make some gains in some areas. We lose momentum in other areas. You know, and economic empowerment is quite broad. So it really depends on how one is defining it. If you're looking at whether we've made progress with respect to larger numbers of women occupying leadership positions in corporate South Africa, yes, we've made some progress in some sectors, not in all sectors. And I think the challenge remains the fact that we don't have the scale. You know, you need sufficient scale to truly transform a system in a sustainable way. Have we made progress with respect to women becoming business owners? I think we have a lot of women who have ventured into their own businesses over the last 30 years. Are they successful? I don't know. Have their businesses survived? I don't have that data. So in terms of opening doors, breaking down the barriers, yes, we have. You know, if a woman wants to become an entrepreneur, she can. If a woman wants to rise in corporate position, she can. You know, it all depends on us. The opportunities are now a lot more available than they were when I started working. I mean, when I graduated from the University of Lesotho, and perhaps because I was amongst the first generation of women to qualify with the commerce degree, it took me a year to find a job. For a year, I was looking for a suitable position and I couldn't find it. You know, but that has changed. I think now women have many options. You know,
I think
that it would take women with suitable qualifications a year to find suitable employment.
you know, with your story, you remind me of the story of the Chinese farmer. Should I tell you about the story of the Chinese farmer?
Yes, please go ahead.
So there was this Chinese farmer, he had cattle, and big farm, you know, just a very wealthy farmer and stuff like that. So the farmer had a horse too. So the horse, another day, the horse runs out the farm, and neighbors come rushing to the farm and say, "Oh, this is bad luck. This is bad luck. I'm so sorry you lost your horse." And and the farmer replies and says, "I don't know if it's a bad day. I don't know if it's bad luck. We'll see the next day." And the son comes riding with the horse, and the neighbors come again saying, "Oh, this is amazing, man. This is the best thing. Your horse came back." And the farmer replies and says, "I don't know if it's good luck. We'll see the next day." And the next day comes, And the next day comes, the son comes riding with the horse and he falls with his back and he breaks his back. And the neighbors come again and says, "Ah, this is bad luck. I'm so sorry. Your son broke his back. Ah, this is." And the farmer replies again and says, "I don't know if it's bad luck. We'll see the next day." And the army comes, um, says, "We are now taking every young adult that is under the age of 25 because we're going to war with the Mongolians." And the farmer replies and says, "My son can go to war because he broke his back." And the neighbors coming back again and saying, "Ah, this is good luck, man. This is great." It's how you interpret the situation. So I feel like even if you're coming from whichever background you're coming from, it's how you perceive it. Because if you're on the ground, you're only looking upwards, you're not looking downwards. So I think that's how you viewed those situations back then, and it inspired so many. That's why you have so many citations with people writing stories about you. So I'm actually inspired to actually speak to you today. It's a privilege and it's a blessing for me today to have a
Sorry,
conversation.
I think that the Chinese story, I've never heard of it before. It's a very beautiful story, and it's an encouraging story because, as you say, life is a function of interpretation. And if our frame of reference is that we we are doing the best that we can, then we interpret whatever happens within that context. And we don't allow circumstances to discourage us, or to diminish our aspirations. We look at it as an experience, and develop an element of curiosity to say, well, what is this circumstance teaching me? Because everything we experience in life, every circumstance that visits us has a purpose. And so if we seek that purpose in everything, we will continue to grow as people, and we will continue to thrive, and we will always overcome whatever challenges come into our lives.
Definitely. Another question. In a male-dominated corporate world, how did you navigate the boardroom politics and ensure that your voice and the voices of women were heard?
I think that the approach for me, Langelihle, is that I've never entertained politics, corporate politics. Let me qualify them. I've never entertained corporate politics because I wouldn't know how to play them. What I've done in the more than 30 years that I've served in any leadership role is that I've always focused on adding value, something that we can only do if we understand the issues. So in any new environment that we get into, we need to understand how things work, inform ourselves and learn. And once we are well equipped to understand what the issues are, we are then in a much better position to add value. Initially, when I joined my first board, I remember that it took at least 5 years for my suggestions to be taken on board, but eventually they were. So I think that whenever we enter a new environment in our life, we need to become students, to be patient, to be resilient, and to just observe for the most part until we are able to identify the unique contribution that can only be made by us. I'm a big believer of diversity, of talent, of intellect, of potential. And if there are 10 of us in a room, it's not possible that we see things the same way. And if we learn to tap into who we are, our authentic potential and contribution, we are then able to add value in environments where we may not see other people who look like us.
Thank you. You've often spoken about purpose-driven entrepreneurship. In today's fast-changing world, what advice would you give to young entrepreneurs who want to create a social impact? Because
Okay.
you like talking about social entrepreneurship. That was your go-to, in your early days.
Right, right. Personally, I believe everything we do must be purpose driven. That's my starting point. We are here for a purpose. And so if we align the choices that we make with the purpose that we believe we're here for, then our ability to reach further in life is is much has a much wider reach. So whether we are employed or we are building a career or whether we are entrepreneurs, in my view, it is the only way for us to honor our gifts and our talents, which are only unique to us. As I said earlier, we don't have the same talents. They might be similar, but they are not the same, and how we express them is not the same. And I believe when we live purposefully and intentionally, it enables us to build a legacy for future generations, because younger people who come behind us can look at what we did and how we did it and be encouraged to recognize their own magnificence. I heard a few days ago of a story of a lady in the 18th century who came to the Western Cape as a slave and was bought out of slavery by a white business person. And she became one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the Western Cape. She owned all of Camps Bay. She owned farms in different parts of the Western Cape. But we don't hear that story. You know, if I had grown up and heard that story in my early education years, I would have been inspired, because here's someone who came from West Africa and found herself in this part of the world and made something meaningful with her life. So, whatever we choose to do, as people to earn a living, I believe that it must be inspired by a desire to serve a meaningful purpose. And how do we create a social impact? We create a social impact when we do what we love. And when we do something that transforms a condition in society whilst we're earning an income. And I think Weephold is a good example of that. We didn't build a nonprofit organization. We built a business that served a condition in society that has transformed how women's financial independence is understood compared to what it was 30 years ago. However, creating social impact is not everyone's cup of tea. So I don't think we should expect everyone who earns a living, who has a job, or who starts a business to fulfill that objective. It's only for those people who feel very strongly about aligning their passion, their talents, and their aspirations. And that's not something that everybody wants to do. It's a choice that we each make.
Definitely. Also, getting into the context of limiting beliefs, how you perceive that something is not possible because of the environment you're in. There's this experiment that was done by, fleas, like a story of the fleas too. So there was an experiment that was conducted, and like scientists basically put fleas in a jar, right? and the fleas basically learned to only jump as high as the limits that was set by the jar.
Mm.
And then the scientists opened up the lid, like the scientists opened up the lid. Once
They
again, the
couldn't
fleas would not, pardon?
couldn't jump beyond the lid.
Yes, they couldn't jump beyond the lid because they were conditioned by the lid. The crazy
Yeah.
part is that when these fleas reproduced their babies adopted the same limitation, and with no lid, they will not jump out of the jar, even though they've never experienced a jar in the first place.
Yeah.
Mental limitations,
Yes.
mental limitations. So
But conditioning
jumping,
in society is very, very it's so dangerous, that I think that our education system should really be helping us to recognize how we've been conditioned. And its objective should actually be to break that conditioning so that people can truly fly as they are meant to.
definitely. Many people see success from the outside, but very few understand the personal sacrifices behind it. What has been the most difficult decision you've had to make in your career, and how did you handle it?
When I wrote Defining Moments, which you mentioned earlier, is not easy to find. I'll send you a copy actually. So at least you will have a copy that you can use to encourage you. It was
Thank you.
exactly for that reason. It was to share with future generations what it required to break through the barriers. So Defining Moments shares the stories from the 70s through the 80s and the 90s. And people share their own stories of what it was like to find a job, because those years there were very few entrepreneurs. Most people who were fortunate enough to have university education got employed. So people share what those stories were like, and how people had to wake up early in the morning to catch a taxi to work, and what it meant if they got to work late, and the prejudices that people had to live with. So I think that those stories help us to really appreciate the courage that it took for people to to be successful in their careers, the resilience and the perseverance that it required of them. And it shows that any failures that we experience along the way are meant to provide us with life lessons. They are not meant to reinforce conditioning of inadequacy, which we sometimes assume to be the case when we fail. Many successful people in the world, well-known scientists and musicians and all kinds of professions, they all went through their fair share of failure. It is from those failures that we actually grow, and we get to refine what our real contribution in the world is meant to be. The adage that you would know coming from KZN is that indlela ibuzwa kwabazayo abayaziyo. You
Yeah,
know,
indlela ibuzwa abaphambili. Yeah.
ibuzwa phambili or ibuzwa kwabayaziyo remains true. When we start our working lives, we have neither the experience nor the wisdom. So we should harvest it from those who've gone before us, those who've already acquired us, who've already acquired it.
Books have a way of changing our perspective on life. I want to know your book that has impacted you to actually change the rewiring that happens in our circuitry and our brains, that reprogrammed you to think differently about life, think differently about business. Because that's a general question I used to ask entrepreneurs, like every interview I get to ask them, like, what type of book that changed your life? Because there's a book by Jennifer Linsley, I think she quoted you and other change makers in South Africa, called Inspired, which inspired so many people. I also got a copy somewhere. I think it was in a library. I'm saying like, I just took a book and I was like, oh, this is interesting. I get to get the names of these people and get to research about them every day and just make sure I get their contact somehow. I want to know what book changed your perspective on life.
So it's a book and it's a poem. Um, I was lucky enough that my dad gave me a book called Your Erroneous Zones by Dr. Wayne Dyer. He's written many other books, but that was the book that my dad gave me for my 21st birthday. And it changed my life because it made me realize that I'm responsible for my life, which was not a concept that was clear to me in my early 20s. You know, at that age, you go through life blaming people and circumstances. You don't realize if all of us would reach our 20s and realize that we are in fact responsible for our lives, not our parents, not circumstances, not poor quality of education, that none of those things, they can all be there. But it's what responsibility we exercise for ourselves to realize the potential that we have. And so that book enabled me to realize that I could not go through life blaming people or circumstances or even apartheid for my misfortunes. And for that, I think I will always be indebted to him because throughout my life, I have approached my life with that understanding that I am responsible. Anything that happens, I'm responsible. And so it helps you to, to be intentional about the choices that you make, to think about the consequences of your choices, because a lot of us find ourselves in unfortunate circumstances really because we made the wrong choices. We didn't consult people who would have helped us to be better informed. We made choices with limited knowledge and information. So taking responsibility for our lives makes us accountable. It really helps us to develop the talents that we bring with us when we come to this world and use them to progress in life. The second one is a poem which came into my life much later. And it just inspired me to live my life with integrity and to live my life authentically. So I'm going to just read the poem to you. It's a short poem.
Yes, please.
It says, I will not die an unlived life. I will not live in fear, fear of falling or catching fire. I choose to inhabit my days, to allow my living to open me, to make me less afraid, more accessible, to loosen my heart until it becomes a wing, a torch, a promise. I risk my significance to live so that which came to me as seed goes to the next as blossom, and that which came to me as blossom goes on as fruit. End of poem. It's by Donna Makova.
Donna Makova.
Yes, Markova, Markova. The first time I read that poem, it just completely blew me away. And it added another depth of encouragement to what I had learned from the book that my father had given me. Because in addition to taking responsibility for our lives, we can be immobilized by fear. A lot of us are immobilized by fear and we don't try things. We don't allow ourselves to truly live fully and meaningfully because we are afraid. And so it helped me develop a different relationship with fear and realize that there will be occasions in life when I experience fear, but I must go ahead and do what I'm inspired to do anyway.
Could you also please uh, just channel us along the journey through? Because I was watching your interview. I forgot the channel, but you spoke of, I don't know if it was your mentor Robert. It's Johann Rupert. Johann Rupert.
Johan
Because
Rupert, yeah.
most people, yes. This, has there any have there any particular moments where you had mentors in your life that guided you towards your destination that you wanted to achieve those tasks? Because I know that after graduating, you went to Joburg looking for a job, but you couldn't find a job, right? You were looking for those people that were going to help you propel your career. Have there any been mentors, and how did they help you? And how important are mentors in anyone's career?
Johan Rupert gave me my first job. So after I was looking for employment for a year, as I mentioned to you earlier, after my graduation, I was introduced to Johan Rupert, and he offered me a marketing position, a trainee. In those years, Black people were employed as trainee officers. So I was offered a position as a trainee marketing or in a trainee marketing position. And that's what really validated me as a person and as a Black woman to be given an opportunity for a proper position, a suitable position for the qualifications that I had by someone that I did not know before, who gave me an opportunity to prove myself and to build a career for myself. So that's the role that Johan Rupert played in my life. And I'm forever indebted to him for that because how we start in life, although it should not determine where we end up, it certainly plays a huge role in how long it takes us to reach the potential that we have. And if we have a false start, if we start inappropriately, it can have an impact on our confidence. It can make us go through life feeling that we are not good enough or we are not, we feel inadequate, which is something that I think most of us go through. But when you start your life where someone who doesn't know you validates you, it just builds so much confidence in who you are as a person, and it gives you an advantage. Actually, it gives you it improves your handicap because as Black people and as Black women, we always start with a handicap. And when you get an opportunity like that, it improves your handicap hugely.
Just going back to what you were saying, it reminds me of this quote I was listening to Daniel the Black Pins podcast. I think the interviewer once said, oh, he was also referring to people getting help along the way. But the interview goes by saying, when you get stuck on the side of the road, get out of your own car because you'll be surprised to see how many people will pass by and start pushing because they say you're pushing. Because it's actually it's easy to help a person with a car but no spare tires, so you can actually give a person a car because it's already on the roadway to that destination or wherever it's going to. Um, with all the knowledge and experiences you've achieved, you've experienced, what advice would you give back to your younger self? Go back to, say, 18 years old, Wendy Luhabe, young, giggly woman, what advice would you give back to that younger person in those early days?
When I grew up, I used to set goals. So I would set much fewer goals. You know, at the end of every year, I was one of those people who would write, what are the goals that I want to achieve in the following year? I would not do that. What I would do more is to be more mindful of the gifts that I've been given, to use those gifts a lot more boldly. And something that I've always done, but I would do it a lot more intentionally. I've always surrounded myself with 5 generations of people. So I always have 2 older generations that I engage with because I believe there's so much I can learn from them. And I always have 3 younger generations below me that I can continue to learn from, but I can also impart my own knowledge and experience too. So I would do that, and I did that intuitively through my life, but I would do it now a lot more intentionally, because there's so much more we can learn from other people. We don't have to figure out life by ourselves, and we don't have to depend just on our parents or people around us. We can actually go and seek people who've done things that we admire. And I would allow divine guidance to order my steps a lot more than I have. I have lived my life in the last however many years that I've lived. But there's very little that I would change. Those would be the few things that I would change. I would not set as many goals because I think they get in the way of how God wants to use us. We should be an open canvas, and just allow God to guide us, and fill the canvas as we get led. So I'd want to live my life as an artist, the way that artists live and the way that they paint, or musicians,
Definitely,
that musicians,
definitely.
their music.
I think we'll